Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome to my guide to Pandemonium as Fidelos' 4th circle on the Savage difficulty. This instance is actually broken up into 2 encounters, with a checkpoint being given for the remainder of the instance after lowering the first boss's health to under 50%. Due to the length of the 2 encounters combined, I decided to split up each boss into its own video. So for this one, if you'd like to check the abilities for the first encounter, please use the timestamps in the description and keep an eye out for the part 2 version of this boss. Also, like with my other guides thus far, this video is based on week 1 strats. Especially when it comes to the 4th encounter, strategies get optimized big time, so expect to learn the fight here, but over time people will definitely optimize and come up with some new stuff. I'll include some alt strategies we used as well in this video. For markers, we just kinda did whatever and marked each cardinal and intercardinal on the arena in a big octagon around the middle. This is mostly for orientation for one mechanic later. We also set up a standard spread, so tanks north and south, healers east and west, and DPS on the intercardinals. I expect this to change in the coming weeks, given the number of possible optimized strategies this encounter allows for. I'll even include one alternate when we get to a mechanic a little bit later on. Also, you'll want to assign light parties of 1 tank, 1 healer, and 2 DPS. For Hesperos' first encounter, you'll have roughly 7 minutes and 15 seconds to reduce his health to under 50% to get the checkpoint for the second half of the fight. At the start of the fight, keep Hesperos in the center of the room and get into that standard spread we set up. For his basics, Decolation is a room-wide AoE, and Elegant Evisceration is a 2-part tank buster, with each hit giving magic vulnerability up. It's intended for you to tank swap, but odds are you'll be tank invulning most of these, and swap whoever's tanking depending on who has their invuln available. The first major mechanic is Bloodrake. This attack will tether either all 4 DPS or the tanks and the healers, dealing big damage to them and absorbing their ether. Do not underestimate the damage from this. Reprisals, addles, trust me, they help. Hesperos will then store this ether for later with Inversive Clamys, and it's very important that you remember which rolls were hit by Bloodrake. He'll then Bloodrake either the 4 DPS or tanks and healers again before casting Director's Belone. He can tether the same roll twice in a row, so don't get caught off guard here. Director's Belone will place 4 roll call debuffs on 2 DPS, 1 tank, and 1 healer. This debuff can be passed between players by running into each other, though a debuff prevents the player from taking it back for a short time after they lose the debuff. If this debuff is on a player of an incorrect roll, it will instantly kill them when the timer expires. So how do you know which roll needs the debuff to avoid death? Simply put, whichever roll was not hit by the second Bloodrake needs to get this virus. So if the DPS were hit by the second Bloodrake, then the tanks and the healers need to all get the roll call virus off of the DPS. Since 2 people who get roll call will always be correct and 2 will be wrong, you just need to carefully have the remaining 2 players pick up the debuff that they need. In our week 1 strategy, we just had the people who needed their viruses removed take a few steps in, and then the correct roll of players would go in and grab the debuffs as needed. Another way that we did this for a little bit was to line up the 4 tanks and healers on one side and all 4 DPS on the opposite side of the boss, then have the players who need the virus run to the opposite side to intercept it. It's important for people not to move unnecessarily here and cross paths, as it may force an unfixable bad virus swap. Personally, I think this will catch on faster for raid teams. About 8 seconds after roll call goes out, Hesperos will begin casting Inversive Clamys. This attack will target 4 players randomly with tethers, and at the end of the cast fire a large circle AoE at them for big damage. The attack is automatically lethal if players of the incorrect roll are hit, much like roll call. The players who need to be hit by this to survive are the players who were not hit by the first Bloodrake. So players unsucked by Bloodrake 1 get tethers, and players unsucked by Bloodrake 2 get roll call. As for positioning here, if you're doing our prog strat with the standard spread, we had all the players who needed tethers just go under the boss to grab them from the opposite roll before spreading. It's very important not to spread early before everyone of the correct roll has the tether. Otherwise, it's possible you could grab a tether off of someone of the same roll, and then they don't have a tether, and then people start dying. At the end of the day though, it's pretty simple to execute and a perfectly okay prog strat. If you're doing the 4 on each side strat, then the players who need the tether would just pass through and grab it off of the other roll. I still recommend not leaving before all the right people have it, for the same reasons again. After everyone has their tethers, make sure everyone spreads out so nothing overlaps, and you should be good and resolved. After that will be another Decolation and the first use of Elegant Evisceration. Then you'll move on to setting the scene number 1. At the start of this mechanic, Hesperos will change all 4 quadrants of the arena to a different element. The center of each quadrant will have an elemental well that, if stood in, deals high damage over time. Just avoid ever touching the dead center of these quadrants. Now just like normal mode, Hesperos will use Pinax to erupt these quadrants one at a time, with each one doing a different mechanic. In Savage though, the rate at which they resolve is much faster, and standing in a quadrant when it erupts will be lethal, eliminating 1/4 of the arena as a safe place for every eruption. You'll need to resolve these mechanics one at a time within the remaining 75% of the room. As a quick refresher, the water eruption will knock players towards the edge of the room, the thunder eruption is a proximity AoE that starts in the center of the room, the poison eruption will do an AoE on each player, so you need to spread, and the fire eruption will do a split damage AoE on both healers. Now the first eruption will always be thunder or water, followed by poison or fire. These first 2 eruptions go off very quickly one after the other, so you'll want to be analyzing what happens and pre-position quickly. First, I recommend identifying the half of the room that's not erupting at all, as that gives you the most space to work with. Regardless of water or thunder first, you'll want your spreads and stacks to look something like this within the safe half of the room. One of the melee with this position will actually be able to kind of loop around the boss after they gap close, which can make room for the tanks to come in and get some damage. If you're not comfortable with that though, just give melee boss priority here, and if the tanks need to back off, then so be it, but players will get better about this over time. If it's thunder plus poison first, people should be spreading as they leave the center of the room, with the melee positioning to gap close back in with that priority that I mentioned you should give them earlier. If it's thunder plus fire, the stack group should be together on the wall, and either safely remain there until they get hit, or consider running back into range of the boss so the melee can keep hitting it. I imagine with more gear, you might start seeing 3-player stacks become a more common occurrence, so the melee can get back to the boss ASAP. If it's water plus poison, you want to get knocked back into your spread positions, again with melee closing back in. If it's water plus fire, then you can actually get into light parties and be knocked back together, or knockback resistance stay in the center of the room for maximum uptime on either side of the boss. After the first 2 Pinaxes go off, then the opposite 2 will next. So if it's thunder plus poison first, then it'll be water plus fire next, etc, etc. While the second water or thunder is charging up, Hesperos will use Shift. It works the same as normal mode, but with less mechanical indicators. To know what direction he is going to teleport, you must look at the cast name for things, such as Westerly Shift or Southerly Shift. To know if it's the Sword Conal AoE or the knockback from the cape, you'll need to look at which of the 2 is glowing on the boss's hitbox. So the second thunder or water Pinax will go off first, then the shift. If it's the sword shift, then get to the wall on either side of the indicator for thunder plus sword, or get knocked to the sides of the indicator for water plus sword. If it's the cape plus shift, then for thunder you need to get to the wall and then move back in front of the indicator for the knockback, or take the knockback from the water and get knocked directly in front of the indicator so it will send you to the other side. Now if you still have knockback resist left and you get the cape here, I definitely use it. It sends you completely across the other side of the arena, and that can be really inconvenient for positioning. It does give you a bit more time for this third and fourth Pinax to spread or stack up with your healers, but it can still really disorient you and your team. For the spread positions, really anywhere on the 3 non-Daedra quadrants works here, but the melees and the tanks might need to do a little bit more work. You can actually put one of them directly under the boss's hitbox, and so long as the other 3 players are max melee, they should be fine, but it is a tight squeeze. The range should also try not to go that far, because there is going to be raid damage both from this and coming afterwards. Now if you get the healer split damage AoEs from fire, we have Light Party 2, which usually has 2 ranged DPS, go in front of the boss, while Light Party 1 with the melee stays behind him. Gotta get them positionals. Since there are a lot of combinations, I'll see if I can include an unlisted video that shows all those combinations playing out roughly in the description. Also bear in mind that the shift can actually force you to play these mechanics right next to the erupting squares, making for a much less comfortable amount of space, especially for the melees. Remember not to stand on the erupting squares as well. It is really easy to forget this while you're, let's say, focusing on the water knockback, but it's important to pay enough attention for this at all times. Once the 4th tile erupts, the boss will do an elegant evisceration, which I recommend you tank involved. After this is an 8-player Bloodrake, which is storing all that ether for another role-based mechanic later. Reprisals and addles, please. Hesperos also tethers 3 of the 4 elemental wells around the room. The untethered well will be the safe element for an upcoming mechanic. With that, we come to setting the scene number 2. Recenter the boss here as quickly as possible, especially since he loves to get stuck casting abilities back to back to back to set everything up. He will move around the locations of the elemental well, so remember which one was safe from the previous Bloodrake. For now, get into the standard positions we assigned at the start, relative to true north, and prepare for the next attack. This is pretty much the only thing we're using those markers for, is to make sure our orientation for this is a-okay. Hesperos will cast a ton of abilities back to back here to give you a bunch of different effects, but it's the same thing every time, so it's really just fluff. Vengeful Belone will give every member in your party an acting role debuff. The DPS will either get acting tank or acting healer, and the tanks and healers will all get acting DPS. If this debuff naturally expires without being dispelled, you die, so we'll dispel it with the next mechanic. Elemental Belone will lower your elemental resistance to the 3 elements Hesperos tethered to earlier, so this is just what forces you to stand in that safe quadrant that wasn't tethered at the end of setting the scene number 1. After that is another Bloodrake on everyone, which is just damage and setting up for the final mechanic of this scene. Watch the damage here with the next mechanic coming right after. To wrap up setting the scene number 2, Belone Bursts from normal mode makes a return. Each player will have the nearest orb tethered to them, which is why it's important you're in your standard spread positions and everyone's about equidistant from their orb. That orb will also be assigned that player's normal role, so DPS will still get a DPS orb tethered to them despite having that acting debuff. Like in normal mode, being hit by your own orb will get you killed, or any orb of the same role. In Savage, there are a few changes, however. The orbs now deal split damage, meaning 2 players need to soak each orb instead of 1. The orbs also dispel the acting role debuffs, so players with acting tank need to be hit by at least 1 tank orb, acting healers hit by at least 1 healer orb, and acting DPS by at least 1 DPS orb. Fortunately, the strategy here completely resolves that with 0 issues. With that standard spread we set up, the 4 DPS orbs will be intercardinal, and the tank orbs will be north and south, with the healer orbs east and west. We just have players converge into the first orbs as they pop up. The north DPS converge north, the south DPS converge south, the north and east tank and healer converge northeast, and the south and west tank and healer go northwest. Then each pair rotates clockwise 90 degrees and quickly grabs a second orb. This lets the DPS pairs both get 1 tank and 1 healer orb apiece, and the tank and healers are always grabbing DPS orbs. All buffs dispelled, all orbs resolved, done. Make sure there are big shields and lots of mit here, as the orb pops are so fast that healing between can be pretty sketch. Second winds, deployed adlos, ranged physical mitts, whatever you got. Expedience in particular is amazing for this. After all the orbs are resolved, Hesperos begins casting Periaktoi, which will ignite all 4 of the elemental quadrants for AoE damage. For this, stand on the one that wasn't tethered during scene number 1. It will still deal high damage, which you'll need to mitigate, but so long as you are healed, it won't be lethal. Next up is another set of roll mechanics with Bloodrake. Definitely center the boss here if it got moved during Belone Bursts. The next 2 Bloodrakes target everyone, but we'll still have another roll call and tethers later, so the way the targets are determined is a little different. After Bloodrake number 1, Hesperos will use Belone Coils, summoning the roll towers from normal mode. All 4 of them will either be DPS or tank and healer. A few Inversive Clamys tethers will go out here too. Simply have 1 player fill each of the towers while the opposite roll gets all the tethers and spreads out. Now, if you grab the tethers here, you're going to be grabbing the tethers later when the mechanic returns. After another 8-person Bloodrake will be another set of Belone Coils. Whoever doesn't get hit by the towers here will be responsible for roll call. Simply put, the rolls excluded from the towers handle the mechanics in a similar fashion to how it was done at the start of the fight. After this is another Decolation and Elegant Evisceration before Hesperos just repeats setting the scene number 1. There's nothing more to say here other than to keep your cool and stay alive. After this final setting the scene ends, you'll have 3 back-to-back Decolation casts, 3 auto attacks, and then Enrage if you aren't under 50% by then. It's especially worth noting that if you get poison spreads before the first Decolation cast at the end of setting the scene number 1, you'll need to heal quite quickly. This is why you shouldn't just spread all the way to the other side of the room just because you don't have any cast times ranged physical jobs. Get in, get the heal in, kill the boss, and you'll be on to the second half of the fight. But that's the second half we'll have to save for another video. Looking at the length, I think I made the right call. With that, thank you for watching my guide to part 1 of P4S. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned because part 2 is on its way. I'll see you guys next time, and until then, take care.